we're continuing on with functions, and we're going to take a look at how does finding a rule and where we're at with that with functions, and how does an input relate to an output. Well, the way it relates is by showing a relationship, and we can show a relationship many ways, and we're going to kind of keep that idea of the function box and using that to help us to describe the relationship as an equation. That's really what we're going to look at, is really trying to see it as an equation. So here we have a table that has x, which is our input, 5, 10, 15, and 20. And we have output of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So basically, it's like having a function machine, and excuse my crude drawing. Okay. And we're saying that something is going into the function machine, something is occurring to it, and something comes out. So our input goes in, something happens to our input, and out comes our output. So when we take a look and see our inputs are getting smaller, they're going into the machine and they're coming out smaller, that means that we have to look at two specific operations. First off, we're going to look at subtraction and division. These two will help us make things get smaller. So let's put in a 5 and see what happens, because we want to get a 1. We want our output to be a 1. Well, if we have a 5, we could subtract 4 and that would get us 1. Or we could divide by 5 and that could get us 1. So what we're going to do is test our next set of input and output and see what happens. As we put 10 into the machine, 10 minus 4 will give us 6, and that's not what we wanted as an output. So we know that the function box or the function machine isn't necessarily doing that. But 10 divided by 5 is 2. So that works. So let's continue with this divided by 5 and make sure it works. 15 divided by 5 is 3. 20 divided by 5 is 4. So we know that dividing by 5 is our function. So again, as I stated before, we were going to write these as equations. So we want to write the equations in terms of the output. So we're going to say y equals, because y is our output. What does the output equal? How do we get there? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to do obviously something to the x, something to the input. We decided that we were dividing by 5, and since we don't use that division sign when we do equations, we use a fraction bar. We're going to say x divided by 5. So if we take the input, divide it by 5, we'll get the output. So this is our equation that shows that that happens. Now, sometimes we don't get the points that way. Sometimes we'll get ordered pairs like 5, 1, 10, 2, 15, 3, and 24. Sometimes that's how our pairs will show up. But even if our pairs show this way, we can still see our inputs and our outputs. All right, let's take a look at one more. And before we do that, I do want to say that sometimes more than one thing does occur in the function box. Sometimes we might divide by something and then add something to it, or multiply by something, then subtract something to it. So it's possible to have more than one thing happening to a number inside the function or the rule, because we've seen equations that have more to it than this, haven't we? So it's possible to have more things happening to that input. So let's take a look at this next one. And so I have the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those are my inputs. And my outputs are 3, 6, 9, and 12. And again, I'm going to use this idea of the function box or function machine, however you want to do it, talk about it, to relate how and what is going on. So we're going to take these first numbers, 1 and 3. So I'm going to put 1 into the function machine, and out's going to pop a 3. Well, since it seems to be getting larger, I know that I'm either adding or I'm multiplying. One of those two things at least are starting to happen. Now, in order to get from 1 to 3, I could be adding 2, or I could be multiplying by 3. Both of those will get me to 3. Plus, there's a bunch of other scenarios. I can multiply times 1 and add 2. There's a lot of things that can happen. So these aren't just the only things that can happen. So let's take a look then at our next one, which is 2 and 6. If I put a 2 in, well, 2 plus 2 is 4, and that's not what I wanted to get, so that's not happening. 2 times 1 is 2 plus 2 is 4, so again, that's not happening. 2 times 3 is 6, so this is looking pretty good. So let's test our times 3 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 3 is 12. So we know that we're being multiplied by 3. So let's write a rule. We're going to say that our output, we're going to take our input and we're going to multiply it by 3. So this is typically the way we're used to seeing it. If you wrote it like this is also correct, as is this, as is this. You know, it always shows different ways how to multiply, but we know that when they're right next to each other, that means that it's multiplication as well. So we don't need to have all the parentheses there if they're right next to each other. So hopefully this just gives a basic idea of how to explain a rule or find a rule and write it as an equation.